Picture this: the year is 1415, and the fields of Agincourt are soaked in blood and mud. The English army, outnumbered nearly 5-1, stands battered but defiant. Yet somehow, against all odds, they claim a victory so shocking it echoes through history. But what if I told you that triumph wasn't just about arrows and armor? Behind the chaos of battle, hidden letters passed between kings, secret treaties sealed in shadow, and whispered alliances turned the tide. This is the untold story of medieval power, where crowns were won not just on the battlefield, but in the silent, treacherous dance of secret pacts. For centuries, history books have painted medieval kings as lone wolves, ruling by divine right and sheer force. But peel back the gilded surface, and you'll find a web of covert deals, betrayals, and backroom bargains that shaped empires. These weren't just handshakes in candlelit chambers, they were the invisible threads pulling the strings of wars, dynasties, and even the fate of nations. Think about it: a king's survival often hinged not on his army's strength, but on which rival he'd secretly promised gold, land, or his own daughter's hand in marriage. The stakes: absolute power or a knife in the dark. So how did these shadowy alliances work? Who held the pen or the dagger when history hung in the balance? From the Templars' vaults to the Vatican's hidden archives, we're about to unravel the lies, the spies, and the coded messages that kept thrones from crumbling. You'll meet monarchs who played both sides, queens who brokered peace with poison, and mercenaries paid to forget what they saw. This isn't just history, it's a thriller, and every whisper could topple a kingdom. Ready to step into the shadows where history's real battles were won? Let's begin. Beneath the grand tapestries and towering castles of medieval Europe, alliances weren't just forged, they were buried. A king's most powerful weapon wasn't always his sword. Sometimes it was a well-timed marriage contract or a whispered promise of mutual defense. Take the marriage pacts, for instance. These weren't romantic unions, they were chess moves. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Louis VII of France, she brought an empire as her dowry. But when that marriage crumbled, she swiftly wed Henry II of England, shifting the balance of power overnight. One divorce and the map of Europe redrew itself. Then there were the military alliances, sealed not with public fanfare but in shadow. Picture Bohemond of Antioch during the First Crusade, secretly negotiating with Byzantine spies to secure safe passage through hostile lands, only to betray his benefactors the moment it suited him. Or consider the Hanseatic League, a network of merchants whose trade agreements doubled as invisible armies. Their ports fed kingdoms, and their silence could starve them. Trade routes became lifelines, and a single embargo could bring a rival to his knees without a single arrow loosed. But why the secrecy? Because trust was a luxury no monarch could afford. Public alliances invited envy, and envy invited knives. The Treaty of Windsor in 1386 between England and Portugal was signed in private, its terms hidden even from most of their own courts. When the Duke of Burgundy secretly funded both sides of the 100 Years' War, his ledgers were written in code because the truth could have sparked revolts. These kings and lords weren't just playing politics, they were survivalists crafting lies within lies to keep their thrones. And that's what made these alliances so fragile and so deadly. A single intercepted letter could unravel decades of scheming. When Richard III's secret pact with Brittany's duke was discovered, it sparked a rebellion that cost him his crown. The medieval world was a hall of mirrors where every handshake hid a dagger. So next time you hear of a famous battle or a royal wedding, ask yourself, what whispers shaped it? The answers might rewrite history itself. Trust in the medieval world was a double-edged sword, sharper than any blade, and just as likely to cut the hand that wielded it. Kings and lords had no choice but to rely on allies, yet every oath sworn in shadow carried the risk of becoming a noose. Take the infamous betrayal of William Wallace. Scotland's hero fought side by side with noblemen like Robert the Bruce, only to be sold out by one of his own, Sir John de Menteith, who handed Wallace to the English for 30 pieces of silver. The price of loyalty, less than a warhorse, but the cost of betrayal, a rebellion crushed and a nation's hope strangled on the gallows. Even blood ties offered no safety. When the French King Charles IV died without a male heir, his nephew Edward III of England claimed the throne by right of lineage. But the French nobility swiftly twisted the rules, invoking an ancient law to block him, sparking the 100 Years' War. Cousins became conquerors and a family tree became a battlefield. Then there's the treachery of Vladislaus of Hungary, who invited his rival John Zapolia to a feast under a flag of truce, only to have him strangled mid-banquet. Trust was the honey that lured enemies into the trap, and betrayal was the slam of the door. Yet some betrayals weren't just personal, they rewrote empires. The Mongol warlord Subutais' siege of Kiev in 1240 relied on Slavic guides who swore allegiance to the city until they led the invaders through its weakest gates. By dawn, the mother of Russian cities was ash, and let's not forget the Albigensian Crusade, where the Count of Toulouse surrendered to the Pope's army, promised mercy, then watched his people slaughtered anyway. The lesson: in medieval politics, survival meant knowing when to clasp hands and when to keep a dagger hidden in your sleeve. The most ruthless rulers understood this dance intimately. Philip the Fair of France spent years smiling at the Templars, dining with their grandmaster, even using their vaults as his personal treasury. Then, in a single dawn raid across Europe, he had every knight arrested on fabricated charges. Their wealth filled his coffers, their screams filled the dungeons. No alliance, no matter how sacred, was immune. Even the church played the game. Pope Alexander VI famously backed both Spain and Portugal in their colonial disputes, collecting gold from each while they carved up continents. So why did anyone bother with trust at all? Because chaos was costlier. A king without allies was a target, but a king who betrayed too often became a pariah. The genius of rulers like Henry V lay in balancing the two, swearing public oaths to reassure allies while keeping private exits for every promise. When his father Henry IV seized England's throne, he spent his reign quelling rebellions sparked by his own broken vows. His son learned the hard way: betrayal might win a battle, but only calculated trust could win a war. The chessboard of medieval power had no clean victories, just gambits where every move risked checkmate. A handshake today could be a dagger tomorrow, and the smartest players knew the game never ended. It just waited, silent, for the next betrayal to begin. Marriage in the medieval world was less about hearts and more about territories. A king's signature on a wedding contract could redraw borders faster than any army. Take Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, whose union in 1469 didn't just unite two sweethearts, it fused two kingdoms into the backbone of modern Spain. Their marriage vows were a military strategy, dissolving centuries of infighting and pooling resources to finally expel the Moors from Granada. But here's the twist: their prenuptial agreement, the Treaty of Segovia, was arguably more important than the ceremony itself. It meticulously outlined who would rule which lands, how taxes would flow, and even where their future children's loyalties should lie. This wasn't romance, it was a corporate merger with crowns. Then there's the audacious maneuvering of Margaret of Austria, the ultimate pawn turned queen. Betrothed at 3 years old to the future Charles VIII of France, she was shipped off to Paris to be raised as his future bride until Charles abruptly ditched her for a richer prize, Anne of Brittany. But Margaret's uncle, the Holy Roman Emperor, didn't waste the insult. He married her off instead to the Crown Prince of Spain, weaving her into a new web of alliances that would later pressure France on two fronts. A child's broken engagement became the thread that pulled Europe into war. And let's not forget the darker side of these unions. When the 15-year-old Philippa of England wed Eric of Pomerania in 1406, Her dowry wasn't just gold, it was an entire military alliance. England promised naval support against Denmark's enemies, essentially outsourcing their wars through a teenage bride. Meanwhile, in the east, Byzantine princesses were routinely dispatched like diplomatic couriers. Theodora Cantacuzene, married off to the Ottoman Sultan Orhan, was expected to soften his raids on Christian lands. Instead, she became a hostage in silk, her influence ignored as her new family kept right on conquering. But the masterstroke of marital strategy, the Habsburgs, they turned weddings into an art form so calculated, their motto might as well have been, "Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry." By wedding cousins, nieces, and distant relatives across every throne from Spain to Hungary, they built an empire where the sun literally never set. Charles V inherited half of Europe not through battles, but through a tangled family tree engineered to avoid inheritance disputes. Of course, the genetic consequences, like the infamous Habsburg jaw, were a grim reminder that even the sharpest strategies have unintended costs. So the next time you hear royal wedding, think beyond the pomp. These ceremonies were chess moves disguised as pageantry, where every veil hid a map and every kiss sealed a treaty. The real vows weren't to love and cherish, they were to conquer and survive. The Vatican's corridors whispered with more than prayers, they hummed with the quiet clink of political gold. When kings couldn't openly negotiate, the Church stepped in as Europe's ultimate mediator, a divine hand guiding earthly power plays. Take Pope Innocent III, the 13th century master strategist who treated thrones like chess pieces. During the brutal Albigensian Crusade, he didn't just bless French knights, he secretly promised Count Raymond of Toulouse leniency if he turned on his own Cathar allies. The Count agreed, only to find the Pope's mercy was a trap. Toulouse's surrender didn't spare his people, it handed France a pretext to annex the south. God's vicar on earth, more like a diplomat with a heavenly loophole. Then there's the audacious balancing act of Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia pontiff who played Spain and Portugal against each other like a fiddle. In 1493, his infamous Treaty of Tordesillas didn't just split the New World between the two crowns, it ensured both paid the Church hefty tithes from their colonial plunder. But here's the twist, the map lines were deliberately vague. When Portugal accidentally drifted into Spanish-claimed Brazil, Alexander turned a blind eye for a larger cut of their sugar trade. Even salvation had a price tag, yet sometimes the Papacy's mediation wasn't about profit, it was about survival. During the brutal wars between the Holy Roman Empire and Lombard cities, Pope Gregory IX brokered secret peace talks in cloistered monasteries. His terms, cities would kneel to the empire publicly but keep their militias intact privately. Both sides saved face, the Pope preserved his influence, and the peace held just long enough for the next betrayal. And let's not forget the ultimate power move, excommunication as a bargaining chip. When King John of England defied the Church over appointing bishops, Pope Innocent III didn't just condemn his soul, he froze England's economy. For 6 years, no baptisms, no marriages, no funerals. Publicly, it was about piety. Privately, John's rival lords used the chaos to force him into signing the Magna Carta. The Pope's spiritual punishment just happened to benefit the barons who'd whispered in his ear, but the real genius of papal mediation, its deniability. When the Templars were purged in 1307, Pope Clement V's public outrage masked his private deal with Philip IV of France. The knight's treasure vanished into royal coffers, the Pope got a cut, and history blamed heresy. No paper trail, just winks and nods beneath gilded ceilings. So next time you see a medieval pope blessing a king, look closer. That raised hand isn't just offering grace, it's steering an empire. Because in the Game of Thrones, even God's representative knew, sometimes the holiest alliances are the ones hidden from the light. Behind the white mantles and red crosses of the Knights Templar lay a shadow empire of vaults, codes, and whispered deals. one that made them the ultimate power brokers of the medieval world. Officially, they were warrior monks sworn to protect pilgrims. Unofficially, they were Europe's first multinational bank, moving fortunes across borders with a system so secure it put kings to shame. Need to fund a crusade but fear bandits on the road? The Templars had a solution: deposit your gold in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem with just a scrap of encrypted parchment. Their network of fortresses doubled as financial hubs where a lord's promise could be traded like currency. But this wasn't just convenience, it was control. When Louis VII of France needed cash for the Second Crusade, the Templars didn't just loan him money, they demanded collateral, including the crown jewels. A king's ransom in every sense. Their real power, though, lay in what they weren't saying. Templar brothers took vows of silence so strict, even their ledgers were written in cipher. A single page might list 30 bolts of cloth as code for 30,000 gold coins, or a shipment of wine for a mercenary army. Their discretion made them indispensable. Elena of Aquitaine used their channels to smuggle funds to rebellious sons plotting against Henry II. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, excommunicated and desperate, relied on their ships to move treasure while the Pope's spies watched every port. The Templars didn't just serve power, they balanced it, lending to both sides of wars with a neutrality that kept their vaults full and their enemies guessing. But secrecy breeds paranoia. By the 1300s, Philip IV of France wasn't just indebted to the Templars, he was terrified of them. Their treasure, rumored to include the lost relics of Jerusalem and even the Holy Grail, could bankroll rebellions. Their loyalty wasn't to crowns but to their own order. So on Friday the 13th, 1307, Philip struck. His soldiers raided Templar preceptories across France, arresting knights on trumped-up charges of heresy. The trials that followed were a masterclass in political theater. Under torture, Grand Master Jacques de Molay confessed to spitting on the cross, then recanted, but the damage was done. The order's assets were seized, its members scattered or burned at the stake. Yet the greatest mystery isn't their fall, it's what vanished with them. When Templar ships fled France that night, they took something. Port records in La Rochelle show vessels laden with unmarked barrels slipping out at high tide, bound for Scotland or Portugal or places history never recorded. Some whisper their treasure financed Robert the Bruce's victory at Bannockburn. Others claim it rebuilt the Knights Hospitaller, the Templars' rivals turned dares. But perhaps their real legacy was proving no alliance is ever truly safe, not even with men who swore to serve God, because in the end, the Templars' greatest sin wasn't heresy. It was knowing too much and being too good at keeping secrets. The Byzantine Empire didn't just survive for over 1,000 years, it mastered the art of political illusion, weaving alliances like a spider spinning invisible threads. While medieval kings in the West clashed openly on battlefields, the emperors in Constantinople played a far subtler game. Their secret weapon, shadow diplomacy, a labyrinth of backroom deals, staged betrayals, and calculated leaks that kept enemies guessing and empires off balance. Take Emperor Justinian I's reign in the 6th century. On the surface, he sent his legendary general Belisarius to reclaim Rome from the Goths. But behind the glory, Justinian was quietly bribing Gothic nobles to defect, funding rebel factions in Persia to distract his eastern rivals, and even hiring Hunnic mercenaries to harass both sides. Every victory on the map was bought as much as it was fought. Then there's the masterpiece of manipulation under Basil II, the Bulgar Slayer. While he's remembered for blinding 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners, his real genius lay in what happened before the battle. For decades, he'd secretly funded rebel princes within Bulgaria, stoking civil wars that drained their treasury. When the Bulgarian Tsar Samuel finally marched against him, Basil's spies had already sabotaged their supply lines, starving the army before the first arrow flew. And here's the twist: those infamous blinded soldiers, Basil sent them home, knowing their agonized return would paralyze Bulgaria with terror. Psychological warfare wrapped in a diplomatic courtesy. But Byzantium's most audacious move was playing the Crusaders against the Muslims while pretending to help both. During the First Crusade, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos swore to support the European knights with supplies and guides. Privately, his envoys were whispering to the Seljuk Turks, offering trade concessions if they weakened the Crusaders just enough to make them reliant on Byzantine aid. Alexios didn't want the Crusaders to lose, he just needed them desperate enough to return captured lands to him. The result, a swath of Anatolia back under Byzantine control, delivered by armies who thought they were fighting for God. And let's not forget the ultimate Byzantine power play, marriage as a honey trap, when the Rus Prince Vladimir of Kiev demanded Emperor Basil II's sister Anna as his bride. Byzantium balked until Viking raiders threatened Constantinople. Suddenly, the marriage was on with one condition: Vladimir had to convert to Christianity. What looked like a royal wedding was actually a conversion gambit. Overnight, Kiev's warriors became Byzantine allies, the Rus abandoned pagan raids, and the empire gained a buffer state against invaders, all for the price of one princess's dowry. The Byzantines didn't just negotiate, they weaponized information. Their diplomats, trained in the art of strategicon, knew when to leak false treaties to provoke enemies into costly mistakes. Their spies, posing as merchants, floated rumors of phantom armies to steer foes into ambushes. Even their silks were political tools. Gifting luxurious robes to foreign ambassadors wasn't generosity. It was a display of wealth meant to intimidate. So why did this shadow diplomacy collapse? The same reason it thrived: overconfidence. By the 1400s, Byzantine emperors had spent centuries playing powers against each other until there were no players left to manipulate. When the Ottomans closed in on Constantinople, the empire's once brilliant network of alliances had frayed into isolation. The lesson: even the sharpest minds can't outwit fate forever. But for nearly a millennium, Byzantium proved that sometimes the deadliest battles aren't fought with swords but with whispers. The Northmen's ships didn't just bring terror, they carried negotiators in wolf pelts, ready to trade blades for titles. Take Rollo, the Viking warlord whose raids had left the Franks trembling. By the year 911, his men were camped outside Paris, not just to pillage but to bargain. King Charles the Simple, too weak to expel them, offered a deal: convert to Christianity, swear fealty, and in return, Rollo would get a crown's weight in land, the future Duchy of Normandy. But here's the twist: the Franks thought they were buying a shield against other Vikings. Instead, they created a dynasty. Rollo's descendants, like William the Conqueror, would use that very land to seize England itself. A wolf doesn't stop hunting just because you feed it. Other Viking warlords saw the genius in this play. In Ireland, Olaf the White didn't just sack Dublin, he married the daughter of a local king, blending Norse steel with Gaelic cunning. His hybrid kingdom became a hub for trade and raids alike, where Celtic allies whispered tips about which monasteries held the richest relics. Over in Russia, Rurik the Dane turned from mercenary to monarch when Slavic tribes invited him to rule Novgorod. Their logic: a foreign king with no local ties couldn't play favorites. They didn't realize they'd just founded the Rurikid dynasty, which would rule Russia for 7 centuries. But the most audacious alliances were those even history struggled to track. Viking sagas speak of secret blood oaths sworn not in halls but in sacred groves where chieftains mixed their own blood with mead and drank to sealed pacts. When Harold Bluetooth wed his sister to the Polish king Mieszko I, the marriage came with a hidden clause: mutual defense against the Holy Roman Empire. No parchment recorded it, the terms were passed in runic carvings only their skalds could decipher. Meanwhile, in Iceland, chieftains gathering at the Althing, their open-air parliament, formally outlawed blood feuds while privately hiring Norse hitmen to settle scores offshore. What made these deals so potent was their fluidity. A Viking ally today might be a foe tomorrow, and both sides knew it. When Svein Forkbeard of Denmark allied with English rebels against King Ethelred in 1013, he took the throne only to die weeks later, leaving his son Not to negotiate with the very nobles who'd fought him. Nut's masterstroke, marrying Ethelred's widow, Emma, binding old enemies into a new family. His court poets called it wisdom, his warriors called it survival. The lesson: the Vikings didn't conquer just with axes, they won with adaptability. A Frankish king might see a treaty as forever. A Northman saw it as until something better comes along. And in that gap between oaths and opportunity, empires were born. Henry II's empire wasn't just built on land, it was woven from a spiderweb of marriages, oaths, and simmering grudges. Crowned King of England in 1154, he inherited a fractured realm, but his marriage to Elena of Aquitaine the year before changed everything. Overnight, he gained control of land stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, a dominion so vast historians call it the Angevin Empire. But here's the catch: holding it required not just swords but a relentless game of kinship chess. Elena's first marriage to Louis VII of France had ended in scandal, but a divorce brought Aquitaine back under her sole control until she handed it to Henry. That single remarriage didn't just redraw maps, it set off a century of conflict between England and France, proving that the most dangerous alliances weren't between strangers, but between ex-spouses and their new partners. Henry's genius lay in binding rivals to him through blood. When his son Geoffrey married Constance of Brittany, it wasn't a love match, it was a land grab. Brittany's fiercely independent dukes had resisted Angevin rule for decades, but with Constance's dowry came a puppet government. Henry let the Bretons keep their titles, but his son's heirs would inherit the duchy. It was a slow-motion conquest disguised as a wedding. Meanwhile, in the south, he played the same game with Toulouse. Rather than invade outright, Henry betrothed his youngest son John to the Count of Toulouse's daughter, aiming to absorb the region through inheritance. The plan backfired when John's reputation as Lackland made the Count balk, but the attempt revealed Henry's strategy. Why waste armies when marriages could annex kingdoms? Yet the Angevins' greatest strength, their family, became their fatal flaw. Elena wasn't just a trophy queen, she'd ruled Aquitaine alone before Henry, and she raised their sons to expect power. When Henry refused to share real authority with young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, they rebelled, egged on by their mother and even Louis VII, who saw a chance to weaken his rival. The civil war that followed wasn't just a family spat, it was a crisis of betrayed alliances. The King of Scotland joined the revolt, hoping to reclaim Northumbria. The Counts of Flanders and Boulogne, tired of Angevin dominance, sent troops. Even Henry's trusted mercenaries switched sides when the rebels offered higher pay. The very web of loyalties Henry had spun now trapped him. And then there was the ultimate irony: Richard the Lionheart's capture. Returning from the Third Crusade in 1192, he was seized by Duke Leopold of Austria, a man Richard had publicly insulted during the crusade. But Leopold didn't act alone. Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI held Richard for ransom, with King Philip II of France cheerfully chipping in to keep his rival imprisoned. The price: 150,000 marks, twice England's annual revenue. To pay it, Henry II's carefully hoarded treasury was drained, taxes soared, and the Angevin Empire began to unravel. The alliances that built it, now they were auctioning it off piece by piece. Elena's final act showed how deeply personal politics could cut. After Henry's death, she backed Richard, then John, against all challengers, including her own grandson Arthur of Brittany, who had a stronger claim. Why? Because Arthur was backed by France. In Elena's calculus, blood mattered less than legacy. Letting a French puppet rule England was unthinkable, even if it meant sacrificing family. Her decision sealed John's disastrous reign and doomed the empire. the Angevins proved that no alliance, no matter how carefully crafted, could survive the weight of ambition. Their story isn't just about land or laws, it's about how love, betrayal, and stubbornness can reshape continents. And perhaps that's their real legacy, the reminder that behind every treaty, every border, there's a human heart, and hearts are far harder to rule than kingdoms. Scotland and France's old alliance wasn't just a treaty, it was a dagger aimed at England's back, wrapped in velvet and sealed with wine. Officially begun in 1295, this pact bound two nations separated by sea but united by a common enemy, English expansion. The deal was simple. If England attacked either, the other would invade English-held lands, forcing their shared foe to fight on two fronts. But beneath the surface, the alliance thrived on shadows. Scottish ships disguised as merchant vessels smuggled French arms into Edinburgh, while French diplomats in Scotland's courts funneled gold to rebellion-minded clans. Even the term Old Alliance was a misdirection. It sounded like an ancient kinship, but in reality, it was a cold-blooded strategy to cripple English power. The alliance's first real test came in 1314 at Bannockburn. When Robert the Bruce faced Edward II's army, it wasn't just Scottish spears that won the day. French advisors had helped train Bruce's troops in countering English longbow formations, while French bankers quietly covered the cost of hiring Flemish mercenaries. After the victory, the payoff was immediate. France recognized Scottish independence, and in return, Scotland sent 5,000 troops to fight alongside the French at the Battle of Bourges in 1421. There, a Scottish spear struck down Henry V's brother, Thomas of Lancaster, proof that the alliance could draw blood. But the real genius of the pact was its flexibility. When Mary, Queen of Scots, was sent to France as a child bride for the Dauphin, it wasn't just a marriage, it was a merger. Had Mary's husband Francis II lived longer, Scotland and France might have unified under one crown, encircling England with a Franco-Scottish superstate. Even after Mary's return to Scotland, the alliance endured through coded letters hidden in wine barrels and Jesuit priests doubling as couriers. Yet the old alliance's greatest impact might have been cultural. Scotland's universities adopted French curricula, while French architects redesigned Edinburgh's fortresses to withstand English sieges. The Scots Guards became the French king's elite bodyguards, their motto, un and tout, one for all, a whisper of solidarity. And when the Reformation split Europe, Catholic France secretly funded Scottish clans resisting Protestant reforms, keeping Scotland divided and England distracted. The alliance finally frayed when Protestant Scotland allied with England against Catholic France in the 1560s, but its legacy lingered. For nearly 3 centuries, it proved that even the smallest kingdom could leverage geography and guile to punch above its weight. And perhaps that's the lesson. In medieval politics, survival wasn't about the size of your army, but the depth of your cunning. The battle lines of the Reconquista weren't drawn in sacred ink, they were sketched in shifting sand. While textbooks paint the 800-year struggle as a holy war between cross and crescent, the truth was far messier and far more fascinating. Christian kings hired Muslim mercenaries to fight their rivals. Moorish emirs paid Christian knights to guard their palaces. Even El Cid, Spain's legendary Christian champion, spent years commanding armies for Muslim rulers. This wasn't heresy, it was realpolitik in an age where survival mattered more than sermons. Take Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, the conqueror of Toledo in 1085. His court poet wasn't a monk, but a Jewish scholar who composed verses in Arabic. His bodyguards, Berber cavalrymen who defected from the rival Taifa kingdoms. When the Almoravid dynasty invaded from North Africa, Alfonso didn't just fight them, he secretly bankrolled their rebellious Andalusian subjects, weakening the invaders from within. Meanwhile, in Valencia, the Muslim ruler Al-Qadir kept his throne by swearing fealty to Alfonso, paying tribute in gold while Christian soldiers patrolled his walls. Faith was flexible when thrones were at stake. The most audacious collaborations happened in the shadows. During the siege of Zaragoza in 1118, the Christian Aragonese King Alfonso the Battler found himself outnumbered until emissaries from the Muslim-led Banu Hud dynasty arrived with an offer. They'd open the city gates if he spared their trade privileges. The deal went deeper. The Banu Hud would become vassals, keeping their religion and laws, while Alfonso got a strategic foothold. It worked so well that within decades, Zaragoza's Muslim quarter was still thriving, its silk workshops supplying robes for Christian bishops. Then there's the tale of Ibn Hud, the last effective Muslim ruler of Mercia. Facing Christian armies and rival Muslim factions in 1238, he didn't surrender, he negotiated. The Treaty of Alcaraz granted him autonomy under Castilian rule, with Muslims retaining their mosques and judges. In return, Ibn Hud's cavalry joined Ferdinand III's campaigns against Seville. For the Castilians, it was smarter to co-opt a leader than provoke rebellion. For Ibn Hud, it was survival with dignity intact, but perhaps the starkest example was the Nasrids of Granada. For 250 years, they ruled Europe's last Muslim kingdom by masterfully playing Christian rivals against each other. When Castile threatened, they called on the Marinids of Morocco. When Aragon grew too powerful, they paid tribute to Castile instead. Their Alhambra palace wasn't just a fortress, it was a stage for diplomacy, where ambassadors from Venice, Genoa, and Tunis mingled under gilded ceilings. The Nasrids even sent troops to help Castile crush Muslim rebellions elsewhere, proving loyalty was transactional, not theological. These alliances weren't betrayals, they were calculations. When the Portuguese King Sancho II needed engineers to siege Lisbon's Moorish walls in 1248, he hired experts from Muslim-ruled Seville. Their catapults shattered the very defenses their brethren had built. Why? Because skilled labor was a commodity and war was business. Similarly, when the Catholic monarchs finally conquered Granada in 1492, their terms weren't immediate expulsion. Muslims kept property rights for years until rising tensions made coexistence untenable. The Reconquista's dirty secret, holy wars are rarely just about holiness. Behind the cries of Santiago and Allahu Akbar, there were always merchants counting coins, kings weighing odds, and soldiers swapping sides. The real battle wasn't between faiths, it was for control. And in that game, the smartest players knew when to clasp hands with the enemy until the moment it was safer to let go. By 1241, the Mongol horde wasn't just a distant rumor, it was a storm breaking over Europe's eastern gates. When Batu Khan's armies crushed Hungary at Mohyj and Polish knights at Legnica, the shockwaves reached palaces from Paris to Rome. Kings who'd spent decades warring over borders suddenly faced an enemy that recognized none. And in that terror, something extraordinary happened. Sworn enemies started whispering. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, excommunicated by the Pope and at war with half of Christendom, sent secret envoys to the Mongols not to surrender but to probe for weaknesses. His spies returned with chilling news. The invaders called themselves the Scourge of God, and they considered all of Europe prey. Frederick wasn't alone in his desperation. Bela IV of Hungary, his kingdom in ruins, did the unthinkable. He begged the Golden Horde's rivals, the Ilkhanate Mongols of Persia, for an alliance. It was like asking a wolf to leash its cousin, but Bela had no choice. Meanwhile, in France, Louis IX, later Saint Louis, briefly halted his crusade against Egypt to entertain Mongol diplomats. Their offer: convert to Christianity and join forces against the Muslims. The catch: Europe would have to accept Mongol overlordship. Louis refused, but the fact he even listened revealed how dire the stakes were. The most surreal negotiations happened in the shadows of the Vatican. Pope Innocent IV sent friars like Giovanni da Pian del Carpine eastward with letters urging the Mongols to cease their unprovoked attacks. The Khan's reply was a masterclass in geopolitical bluntness. You must come in person and serve us. Yet even as these overtures failed, another pattern emerged. The Mongols weren't mindless destroyers, they were predators who respected strength. When Bohemia's King Wenceslaus reinforced his castles and scorched the countryside ahead of their advance, the horde bypassed his lands entirely. Word spread, preparation bought survival. By 1260, the calculus shifted. The Mongol Empire fractured into rival khanates, and Europe's rulers saw an opening. The Golden Horde, now ruling Russia, began playing Europe's kings against each other. In Lithuania, Grand Duke Gediminas used Mongol tactics to expand his realm while secretly encouraging Russian principalities to rebel against their overlords. Venice and Genoa, those eternal commercial rivals, both established trading posts in Mongol-controlled Crimea, paying tribute for access to the Silk Road while quietly arming Mongol enemies in the Caucasus. The irony, the Mongol threat didn't unite Europe, it revealed how fractured it truly was. When the Golden Horde converted to Islam in the early 1300s, Christian kings still traded with them, prioritizing profit over piety. And when the Black Death swept out of Mongol-held lands in 1347, the same ports that had grown rich from trade became Europe's graveyards. The lesson was clear. In the face of existential threats, alliances weren't about loyalty. They were about living to fight another day. The Hanseatic League never raised an army they didn't need to. Their weapons were wool, salt, and the ruthless calculus of supply chains. By the 1400s, this network of merchant guilds stretched from London to Novgorod, controlling trade routes with a grip tighter than any king's. But their real power wasn't in the goods they moved, it was in the silence they kept. Need timber for your navy, the Hanse could turn every Baltic port against you. Want grain during a famine, their ledgers decided who ate and who starved. And when kings like Edward IV of England tried to defy them, they learned the hard way: money talks louder than swords. Take the Sound dues, the tolls the Danes charged ships entering the Baltic. On paper, it was Denmark's right as gatekeeper. In reality, the Hanse negotiated secret exemptions for their members, undercutting rivals while pocketing the difference. When King Eric of Pomerania tried to raise the tolls in 1429, the League didn't protest. They simply diverted every ship to alternative ports for a year, crushing Denmark's economy until Eric capitulated. No war, no treaties, just cold, hard market force. Even more audacious was their manipulation of sovereign debt. Cash-strapped rulers routinely borrowed from Hanseatic bankers, using customs revenues as collateral. But the terms were traps. When the Norwegian king defaulted in 1349, the League seized Bergen's trading posts, effectively colonizing Norway's economy without firing a shot. In Bruges, they turned the city's dependence on their wool trade into political leverage, forcing local councils to grant them extraterritorial rights. Their merchants lived under Hanseatic law, immune to local courts, while their warehouses became sovereign enclaves. The League's true genius, though, lay in their information network. Their couriers moved faster than royal heralds, carrying price lists and political gossip between counting houses. When the Teutonic Knights planned raids on Lithuanian lands, it wasn't spies who warned Vilnius, it was Hanseatic traders protecting their amber routes. Their quiet men in every port weren't just merchants, they were diplomats, intelligence gatherers, and sometimes blackmailers. A drunken noble's debt to a Lübeck moneylender could become leverage to sway a vote in the next royal council. But their masterpiece was the contour system, trading posts that doubled as shadow governments. London's Steelyard, a walled compound by the Thames, wasn't just a marketplace. It had its own jail, weighhouse, and even a private militia. When English wool merchants tried to bypass Hanseatic middlemen in 1470, the League retaliated by shutting off Flemish cloth imports, strangling England's textile industry until the Crown revoked the upstarts' privileges. The lesson: the Hanseatic League proved that economics could be warfare by other means. They toppled no thrones, but they bent kings to their will with ledger books and supply shocks. And when their power finally waned in the 1600s, it wasn't defeat, it was obsolescence. They'd taught Europe too well. Nations now played the game themselves, with navies as their merchant fleets and tariffs as their swords. The age of silent empires was over, but for 3 centuries the Hanse whispered and monarchs listened. Joan of Arc's visions might have been divine, but her rise to power was anything but miraculous. Behind the peasant girl who claimed to hear saints stood a web of French nobles and clergy with everything to gain from her sudden ascent. In 1429, France was fractured. The English held Paris, the Burgundians sided with them, and the Dauphin Charles VII's claim to the throne was so shaky even his own mother called him a bastard. Then came Joan, a teenage girl from Domremy, insisting God had chosen her to crown Charles at Reims. Convenient timing, perhaps, but look closer and you'll find the fingerprints of Yolande of Aragon, Charles's mother-in-law, and the real power behind his crumbling court. Yolande wasn't just a queen, she was a master strategist. With her son-in-law's legitimacy in tatters, she needed a symbol to unite France. Joan, with her rustic piety and unshakable confidence, was the perfect figurehead. Yolande's agents likely coached Joan through her initial encounters with Charles, ensuring she passed every test, recognizing the disguised Dauphin in a crowded room, recounting private prayers only he would know. The so-called miracle of their meeting was stagecraft designed to cement Joan's credibility, and it worked. Suddenly, Charles had a heavenly mandate and Yolande had a weapon. But Joan's backers went beyond the French court. The Armagnac faction, desperate to break England's grip, saw her as a rallying cry for their cause. Their gold funded her armor, their bishops endorsed her visions, and their propaganda machine spun her into a living saint. Even the Dauphin's confessor, Gerard Machet, played his part, quietly assuring Charles that Joan's mission was genuine, despite reservations from more skeptical clerics. This wasn't just faith, it was a coordinated campaign to rebrand a losing war as a holy crusade. Then there's the military angle. Joan's sudden tactical brilliance at Orleans raised eyebrows. A girl who'd never held a sword outmaneuvered seasoned English commanders. More likely, she was the public face of a strategy crafted by veterans like Jean de Dunois and Gilles de Rais. Their battle plans, aggressive assaults, night marches, psychological warfare bore the hallmarks of professional soldiers, not a shepherd's intuition. Joan's role to inspire the troops and terrify the enemy. When she waved her banner at Patay, spurring the French to their first major victory in decades, it wasn't just courage, it was theater. Yet Joan's usefulness had an expiration date. After Charles's coronation at Reims, her influence waned. The Burgundians, once terrified of her, realized she could be captured without divine retribution. When they seized her at Compiègne in 1430, Charles made no move to rescue her. Why would he? Joan had served her purpose, legitimizing his rule, and her growing independence threatened his delicate negotiations with Burgundy. Even her trial was political theater. The English needed her branded a heretic to undermine Charles's legitimacy, while the Church sought to assert its authority over visionaries. No one in power wanted the real Joan to survive. The tragedy of Joan of Arc isn't just her burning at the stake, it's how swiftly her allies vanished once she'd outlived her purpose. Her story reveals the brutal calculus of medieval alliances. Symbols are powerful, but only as long as they're convenient. And in the end, even a girl who talked to angels couldn't outmaneuver the cold machinery of kings and bishops. The Wars of the Roses weren't fought on battlefields alone. They were waged in shadowed chapels and candlelit chambers, where a whispered promise could topple a throne. For 30 bloody years, England's nobility played a lethal game of musical chairs, switching sides between the houses of York and Lancaster with a ruthlessness that would make modern politicians blush. Take Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, dubbed the Kingmaker for his ability to crown and uncrown monarchs. He began as the Yorkists' fiercest champion, putting Edward IV on the throne in 1461. But when Edward married Elizabeth Woodville against Warwick's wishes, the Earl's wounded pride turned treasonous. By 1470, he'd secretly aligned with Margaret of Anjou, the exiled Lancastrian queen, and even married his daughter to her son, a union dripping with irony since Warwick had once slaughtered Margaret's armies. His betrayal wasn't personal, it was survival. In a world where losers lost their heads, loyalty was a currency spent carefully. The Woodvilles themselves were masters of the backroom deal. Elizabeth, Edward's queen, wasn't just a beautiful widow. She was a dynastic schemer who placed her relatives in marriages so strategic they'd make a chess grandmaster weep. Her brother John wed the wealthy Duchess of Norfolk, 40 years his senior, while her 20-year-old son Thomas Grey snatched the heiress to the Exeter fortune. Each union strengthened Yorkist influence, but at a cost. The old nobility seethed at these upstarts, and their resentment festered into rebellion. The Woodvilles didn't just marry for love or land, they married for leverage. Yet no betrayal stung like George, Duke of Clarence's. Edward IV's own brother, lured by Warwick's promises, joined the revolt against him in 1469. The price: Warwick offered Clarence the throne if Edward fell. But when the plot collapsed, Clarence slithered back to his brother's side, only to betray him again years later. His final act, a doomed conspiracy that ended with him drowning in a barrel of Malmsey wine, a fitting end for a man who drowned in his own ambitions. The most chilling alliances, though, were the silent ones. After Edward's death in 1483, his brother Richard III reportedly had his nephews, the famous Princes in the Tower, disappear. But the crime's true horror lies in how many benefited from it. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, raised troops for Richard, then suddenly switched sides to back Henry Tudor. Was it conscience or calculation? Even Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother, navigated the chaos with icy precision. While outwardly submitting to Richard, she secretly funded Tudor's invasion from Brittany, her agents weaving a web of promises to discontented Yorkists. Her masterstroke, persuading Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of the missing princes, to betroth her daughter to Henry, a move that merged Yorkist and Lancastrian claims with a single stroke of a pen. Bosworth Field in 1485 wasn't just a battle, it was the culmination of decades of broken oaths. When Stanley's forces held back until the crucial moment, then charged to Henry's aid, it wasn't courage, it was a last-minute deal sealed with nods, not signatures. The crown Richard wore into battle was found hanging in a thorn bush, a poetic end for a war where loyalty pricked like roses' thorns. The Wars of the Roses proved one brutal truth. In medieval politics, there were no permanent allies, only permanent interests. Nobles didn't wear white or red roses out of devotion. They stitched them onto their sleeves until it was safer to rip them off and sew on new ones. And the smartest players, they kept a needle and thread tucked in their doublets, ready to change colors when the wind shifted. The Borgias didn't just play the game of power, they rewrote the rules with poison, gold, and strategically placed wedding rings. When Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, he didn't just inherit the keys to St. Peter's, he seized them through a web of bribes so audacious even his rivals were impressed. Cardinals who'd sworn vows of poverty suddenly found their pockets heavy with Borgia silver, their votes secured not by divine inspiration but by bags of ducats. Yet the real scandal wasn't the simony, it was how openly Rodrigo flaunted it. While previous popes hid their corruption behind piety, Alexander hung his ambitions like tapestries, lavish, unmissable, and woven with threads of venomous cunning. His children were the living instruments of that ambition. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's illegitimate son, wasn't just a ruthless condottiero, he was a geopolitical scalpel carving up Italy to serve the family's rise. When the French King Charles VIII marched into Naples, Cesare didn't resist, he escorted him, wearing a mask of loyalty while whispering plans to exploit the chaos. Later, as the Pope's enforcer, he orchestrated the murder of his own brother Giovanni, removing a rival for power while framing it as a random street crime. The message was clear: even blood wasn't sacred when the Borgias played for thrones, but the family's deadliest weapons were their daughters. Lucrezia Borgia, often reduced to a poisoned ring caricature, was actually a masterstroke of dynastic engineering. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro wasn't love, it was a foothold in Milan's power structure. When the alliance soured, Alexander didn't bother with annulments. He sent armed men to extract a confession from Giovanni that the marriage had never been consummated, a lie so humiliating it shattered Sforza's reputation. Lucrezia's next match, to Alfonso of Aragon, tied the Borgias to Naples' royal bloodline until Cesare decided a French alliance was more valuable. Alfonso's murder in his own bed wasn't just a crime, it was a receipt for services no longer required. The Borgias' genius lay in their network of spiritual alliances. When the Pope needed to silence critics, he didn't order assassinations, he promoted bishops loyal to the family into the College of Cardinals, turning Christ's apostles into a private voting bloc. Their infamous banquet of chestnuts, where courtesans crawled naked to collect prizes, wasn't just debauchery, it was blackmail disguised as revelry. Every guest left with a secret too damning to betray, yet their downfall came from overreach. Cesare's conquest of the Romagna was brilliant until he ran out of enemies to bribe and brothers to kill. When Alexander died suddenly in 1503, likely from poisoned wine, meant for someone else the family's web unraveled overnight. Their legacy proof that the dirtiest deals aren't made in battlefields, but in bedchambers and confessionals where faith and treachery wear the same robes. The Ottoman Empire didn't just conquer with janissaries and cannon. They mastered the art of playing Christian kings against each other, turning Europe's divisions into their own advantage. While the Pope preached holy war, Sultan Mehmed II was signing treaties with Venice, granting lucrative trade concessions in exchange for intelligence on his enemies. When Hungary's Matthias Corvinus marched against him, Mehmed didn't just meet him on the battlefield. He secretly funded rebellions in Bohemia to stretch Hungarian forces thin. The Ottomans understood something Europe's princes often forgot. Faith made poor diplomacy, but gold and shared rivals made unshakable alliances. Take the shocking case of France, the so-called eldest daughter of the Church. In 1536, King Francis I did the unthinkable. He allied with Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent against their mutual foe, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The pact, negotiated through coded letters and Venetian intermediaries, allowed French ships to dock in Ottoman ports while Turkish cavalry diverted imperial troops from France's borders. The deal was so scandalous that Parisian pamphleteers called it the Lily and the Crescent's embrace, but Francis cared more about survival than optics. His gamble paid off. Charles was forced to split his armies, and France kept its borders intact. Even the Vatican wasn't immune to Ottoman pragmatism. When Pope Pius II planned a grand crusade in 1464, he assumed all Christendom would rally. Instead, he found Venetian merchants whispering to Ottoman officials, trading crusade plans for guaranteed access to eastern spice routes. By the time the papal fleet sailed, Mehmed had already fortified every harbor. The lesson: trade routes were holier than holy wars for those counting coins. But the Ottomans' most enduring alliance was with Protestant rebels. When Lutheran princes rebelled against Catholic Habsburg rule in the 1600s, Istanbul didn't just cheer from the sidelines, they sent diplomats to Saxony, offering military subsidies if the princes kept Austria distracted. Sultan Murad IV even issued a decree praising Lutherans as fellow enemies of idolatry, a stunning pivot for a caliphate that had once threatened Vienna. The Habsburgs, fighting on two fronts, could never fully crush the Reformation, thanks to Ottoman gold and grudges, yet the ultimate irony lay in the Crimea. For centuries, the Khanate of Crimea, a Muslim state, was the Ottoman Empire's attack dog, raiding Poland and Russia for slaves. But when Moscow grew too powerful, the Crimean Khans did the unthinkable. They secretly negotiated with the Poles, offering to halt raids in exchange for land and autonomy. The Ottomans, sensing betrayal, replaced the Khan only for his successor to play the same game. Alliances here weren't about faith or loyalty, but the steppe's oldest rule: the wolf hunts with the pack until hunger makes the pack prey. The Ottomans' real genius was knowing when to break their own rules. After losing the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, they didn't double down on holy war. They rebuilt their navy with help from Elizabethan England, who saw Catholic Spain as the greater threat. Turkish shipwrights studied captured English designs, while Ottoman envoys entertained Protestant ambassadors with feasts beneath the Topkapi's mosaics of Christian saints. For a fleeting moment, the terror of Christendom and the heretic queen found common cause. So why did these alliances crumble? Because empires, like all predators, eventually run out of rivals to exploit. By the 1700s, Europe had grown wise to the game. When the Ottomans allied with Sweden's Charles XII against Russia, Peter the Great simply outbought them. But for 3 centuries, the sultans proved that the sharpest sword wasn't steel, but the ability to make yesterday's enemy tomorrow's pawn. The Teutonic Knights didn't just wear white mantles, they cloaked their ambitions in layers of deception and cold pragmatism. Officially, they were crusaders, sworn to defend Christendom on the Baltic frontier. Behind closed doors, they were empire builders, cutting deals with local rulers that turned piety into power. Their conquest of Prussia wasn't won with sword strokes alone. It was secured through a web of secret treaties, staged betrayals, and whispered promises that would make a modern spy blush. One of their earliest covert pacts involved Duke Conrad of Masovia, a Polish ruler desperate to crush Prussian raids on his lands. In 1226, he gifted the Knights territory near Chelmno, supposedly as a base for defending Christendom. But the fine print told another story. The order would keep any lands they conquered. Conrad thought he was outsourcing his border wars. The Knights saw an invitation to carve out a private kingdom. Within decades, they'd turned this temporary grant into a sovereign state, answerable only to the Pope. The real masterstroke came with their dealings in Lithuania, Europe's last pagan stronghold. Publicly, the Knights waged a holy war against Lithuanian tribes. Privately, they played both sides. When Grand Duke Vytautas rebelled against his cousin Jogaila in the late 1300s, the Knights secretly armed him only to later betray him by leaking his plans to Jogaila. Why? Because a divided Lithuania was easier to exploit than a united one. The Order's chronicles paint them as holy warriors, but their ledgers reveal a different truth. Payments to Lithuanian informants, bribes to tribal chiefs, and even contracts with pagan mercenaries who fought under the cross for the right price. Even their famed brick castles were instruments of psychological warfare. Built along river routes, these fortresses weren't just military bases, they were trading hubs where the Knights monopolized amber, grain, and timber. Local rulers who cooperated got a cut of the profits. Those who resisted found their economies strangled. In Riga, the Order's alliance with merchant guilds let them control the city's votes in the Hanseatic League, turning commercial networks into political weapons. But their darkest alliances were with the Church itself. When Pope Innocent IV issued the Golden Bull of Rieti in 1234, it didn't just bless the Knights' conquests, it absolved them of all obligations to secular rulers. With this papal blank check, they seized lands from Polish princes under the guise of protecting them, then demanded tribute from the very rulers they dispossessed. Their envoys in Rome spun tales of pagan atrocities to justify every expansion, while their spies in Venice secured loans to fund campaigns the Vatican never fully understood. The Knights' downfall came when their web grew too tangled. In 1410, their defeat at Grunwald exposed the fragility of these shadow pacts. Polish-Lithuanian forces crushed their army not just with strength, but by exploiting distrust among the order's mercenaries, many of whom had been quietly promised better pay by King Jagiellon's agents. Even their Livonian branch, long seen as loyal, began negotiating separate peace deals the moment the tide turned. The Teutonic Knights proved that in medieval geopolitics, the holiest wars were often fought with the dirtiest tactics. Their legacy isn't just castles or crusades, it's a playbook for how faith, fear, and backroom deals could build an empire and how quickly it could unravel when the secrets came to light. The wedding of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1469 wasn't love at first sight, it was a meticulously brokered merger, crafted in the shadows of warring courts and half-finished treaties. Behind the pageantry of their Valladolid ceremony lay years of secret negotiations, where the fate of Spain hinged on loopholes, lies, and the cold calculus of royal survival. Isabella wasn't even Ferdinand's first betrothed. His father, King John II of Aragon, had initially promised him to another princess, Isabel of Portugal. But when John died suddenly in 1479, leaving Aragon weakened and Isabella's half-brother Henry IV of Castile wobbling on his throne, the chessboard shifted. Isabella's faction, led by her ruthless advisor Archbishop Carrillo, saw opportunity. A union with Aragon could secure her contested claim to Castile. The real drama unfolded in the Treaty of the Bulls of Gisando, a document so contentious its ink might as well have been mixed with blood. Henry, pressured by rebellious nobles, reluctantly named Isabella his heir, but with a catch. She couldn't marry without his approval, a clause meant to keep her dependent. Isabella ignored it. While Henry tried to pawn her off to aging suitors like the King of Portugal, she secretly exchanged letters with Ferdinand through a network of Franciscan friars and Jewish couriers. Their proxies met in dingy inns along the Castilian frontier, haggling over dowries and succession rights like merchants trading spices. Ferdinand's team played their own games. His father had left Aragon drowning in debt, and Castile's vast territories offered salvation. But to avoid provoking Henry, Ferdinand slipped into Castile disguised as a muleteer, his red hair hidden under a filthy cap, while Isabella's allies spread rumors she was kidnapped to justify the elopement. The marriage contract itself was a masterpiece of realpolitik. Ferdinand got the title of king, but Castilian laws kept real power with Isabella, a concession his advisors swallowed only because they knew Aragon's survival depended on Castilian gold. The backlash was immediate. Henry disowned Isabella, triggering a civil war where Portugal backed his daughter Juana's rival claim. But Ferdinand and Isabella's alliance had teeth. They leveraged Aragon's Mediterranean trade networks to fund Castilian troops, while Isabella's charismatic leadership rallied townsfolk against the Portuguese. Their victory at Toro in 1476 wasn't just a military turning point. It was proof that their union could outmaneuver older, richer rivals. Yet the true genius of their partnership lay in the details. They created a joint monarchy where each realm kept its laws and customs, but coordinated policy through a web of interlocking councils. The Inquisition, ostensibly a religious tool, became a centralized spy network, rooting out dissent under the guise of piety. And when Granada fell in 1492, their propagandists didn't credit generals or nobles. They framed the victory as divine validation of the marriage itself. By the time Columbus set sail that same year, their union had turned fractured Iberia into a proto-superpower, but the cost, a trail of broken promises. Ferdinand later betrayed Isabella's will by remarrying to sire a male heir, nearly splintering their life's work. The lesson: even the most brilliant alliances are built on sand, and the tide always comes in. The 100 Years' War wasn't just a clash of kings. It was a shadow war fought by bankers, mercenaries, and foreign courts who profited from the chaos. While English longbows and French knights dominated the battlefield, the real architects of this century-long conflict were often men who never drew a sword. Take the Lombard bankers, those discreet money lenders from Italy who funded both sides with cool impartiality. When Edward III of England defaulted on his debts in 1340, sparking a financial crisis across Europe, it wasn't just a royal embarrassment, it was a calculated risk. The Florentine banking houses of Bardi and Peruzzi had already siphoned vast sums into his campaigns, knowing that if he won, their returns would be legendary. When he lost, they collapsed, but not before their gold had prolonged the war by decades. Then there were the Free Company's rogue armies of discharged soldiers who sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. These weren't just bands of thugs, they were corporations of carnage with their own accountants and legal advisors. The Great Company, led by the mercenary Albert Sturs, didn't just fight for pay, they extorted entire regions. In 1362, they held the Pope himself hostage in Avignon, not for ideology, but because the papal treasury was fatter than any king's. Both England and France secretly hired these bands during truces, keeping the war simmering even during so-called peacetime. Why disband an army when you could outsource the bloodshed? Foreign powers also twisted the conflict to their own ends. Scotland's old alliance with France was more than sentimental, it was a lifeline for a kingdom choking on English ambition. When David II of Scotland was captured at Neville's Cross in 1346, French gold quietly funded his ransom, ensuring Scotland remained a thorn in England's side. Meanwhile, Castile's Peter the Cruel used the war to settle his own scores, lending his formidable navy to France in exchange for their backing in his civil war. His galleys crushed England's fleet at La Rochelle in 1372, proving that the 100 Years' War was as much about Mediterranean politics as it was about Gascon vineyards. Even the church played both sides. Cardinal Henry Beaufort, England's wealthiest prelate, loaned vast sums to Henry VI's campaigns while simultaneously negotiating with the French through back channels. His ambition wasn't peace but leverage. If England won, he'd be a kingmaker. If they lost, his French contacts would spare his estates. And let's not forget the Burgundians, whose feud with the French crown turned them into England's temporary allies. John the Fearless's assassination in 1419 wasn't just a crime. It was a business decision by the French faction, removing a man who'd grown too cozy with English gold. The war's final twist came from an unexpected quarter, the Hanseatic League. These merchant princes cared little for crowns, but everything for control of the wool trade. When England blocked their ships, they quietly redirected Flemish weavers to French markets, strangling England's economy. No battles, no sieges, just ledgers and embargoes that bled the treasury dry. The lesson: the longest war in medieval history wasn't sustained by patriotism or even ambition alone. It was fueled by the silent partners who turned bloodshed into a business model and proved that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't an arrow, but a ledger book smeared with ink and just enough blood to make it binding. Edward the Black Prince wasn't just a warrior, he was a master of the shadow game, wielding charm and treachery with equal precision. While his victories at Crécy and Poitiers are legendary, his real genius lay in the quiet deals struck behind closed doors, where a handful of gold or a whispered promise could fracture French unity. Take his Aquitaine campaign in 1355. Instead of burning his way through the countryside, he courted disgruntled French nobles with a mix of flattery and cold pragmatism. The Count of Armagnac, furious at King John II for withholding lands, didn't need much convincing to switch sides. Edward granted him titles, tax exemptions, and a personal guard of English archers, effectively turning a French prince into a puppet ruler draped in velvet chains. But the Black Prince's deadliest weapon wasn't his sword, it was his reputation for keeping promises. When the Gascon lords hesitated to join him, fearing English betrayal, he didn't threaten, he dazzled. His court at Bordeaux became a stage of opulence, where troubadours sang of chivalry and wine flowed freely for any noble willing to bend the knee. To Charles the Bad of Navarre, a slippery opportunist with claims to the French throne, Edward offered something irresistible, a slice of Normandy in exchange for harassing King John's supply line. The deal was sealed not with a solemn oath, but at a week-long feast where spies from both sides mingled beneath hanging tapestries, each pretending not to notice the other. Yet the prince's greatest coup was subtler still. While besieging Limoges in 1370, he learned its bishop, a French loyalist, was secretly resented by the city's merchants. Instead of assaulting the walls, Edward sent envoys disguised as wool traders, spreading rumors that the bishop planned to divert their wealth to Paris. Within days, the city gates creaked open in silent revolt. The prince entered not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, pillaging anyway, but letting the merchants keep just enough to blame their ruin on the bishop's treachery. These alliances, though, carried a fatal flaw. The Black Prince's system relied on his personal magnetism and deep coffers. When dysentery sapped his health and England's treasury ran dry after Poitiers, the loyalty of bought nobles evaporated like morning mist. The very Gascon lords who toasted him with Aquitaine's finest vintners now whispered to Charles V of France, trading their English titles for new French ones. The prince's final lesson was the cruelest. In the end, even the shrewdest diplomacy can't replace victory on the battlefield, or the cold weight of gold in a mercenary's palm. The Alpine passes of medieval Europe weren't just trade routes, they were the lifelines of a silent revolution. While kings and emperors clashed over crowns, the mountain communities of Switzerland were forging something radical, a web of secret pacts that would defy empires. The legendary Rutli Oath of 1291, where representatives from Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden supposedly swore mutual defense against Habsburg oppression, was more than folklore. It was the blueprint for a new kind of power, one built not on feudal loyalty, but on cold, collective pragmatism. These weren't knights pledging to a lord, they were farmers and herders agreeing that an attack on one valley meant war for all. And they kept their alliances so quiet that Habsburg tax collectors often didn't realize they were walking into a trap until the Alpine horns echoed and the roads vanished beneath avalanches of rocks. The Confederacy's real genius lay in its structure. Each canton maintained sovereignty but agreed to a simple rule: no member could make separate peace with outside powers. When Leopold I of Austria sent his armored knights to crush the peasant rabble at Morgarten in 1315, he expected easy plunder. Instead, his forces were funneled into a narrow pass where Swiss halberdiers, tipped off by coded messages hidden in milk shipments, ambushed them from above. The victory wasn't just tactical, it sent a message. Suddenly, minor towns like Lucerne and Zug were clamoring to join the secret alliance, offering their militias in exchange for protection. By 1353, even the wealthy city-state of Zurich signed the Pfaffenbrief, a treaty so discreet its full terms were only whispered to trusted councilmen. What made these pacts so effective was their economy of force. Unlike feudal levies that took weeks to muster, Swiss militias could mobilize in hours using a system of fire beacons and couriers disguised as pilgrims. When Duke Sigismund of Austria tried to blockade their trade in 1474, the Confederacy didn't meet him head-on. They leaked false routes to his spies, lured his mercenaries into ambushes, then hired those same mercenaries' unemployed comrades to fight for them instead. Their reputation for ruthlessness became their shield. After the Burgundian Wars, when Swiss pikemen butchered Charles the Bold's elite cavalry at Nancy, even the French king hesitated to test their mountain fortresses. Yet the Confederacy's survival hinged on more than violence. They mastered the art of playing rivals against each other. In 1499, when the Swabian League threatened invasion, Swiss diplomats secretly promised Emperor Maximilian I their mercenaries for his Italian wars in exchange for imperial recognition of their autonomy. The same pikemen who'd slaughtered Habsburg troops became the empire's most feared export, their service contracts funding the very independence they'd fought for. Venice, France, and the Vatican competed to hire Swiss guards, not realizing their gold was financing the one army in Europe that refused to kneel. The lesson: While flashy kingdoms rose and fell, the Swiss built their sovereignty stitch by stitch, like a quilt of steel hidden under wool. Their alliances weren't written on parchment, but in the geography of the land itself, every pass a choke point, every village a fortress. And when the smoke cleared, it wasn't the emperors who endured, but the shepherds who'd learned to whisper in the shadows. Constantinople's final days were not just a siege, they were a masterclass in betrayal, where old allies sharpened knives behind smiles. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to little more than its glorious capital, a shadow of its former self. Yet even in its twilight, the real threat wasn't just maimed the Second's cannons. It was the Venetian and Genoese merchants who'd grown fat on Byzantine trade while secretly hedging their bets. Take the Genoese colony of Galata just across the Golden Horn. Officially neutral, its leaders swore oaths to Constantinople. Privately, they maimed the very timber and iron his engineers needed to build the siege towers now looming over the Theodosian walls. The ultimate betrayal, Genoese mercenaries, some of whom had once defended the city, now fought under Ottoman banners, their crossbow bolts finding Byzantine backs. Venice played an even colder game. While their Senate publicly vowed support for Byzantium, their merchants in Constantinople quietly shipped out shiploads of gold and relics weeks before the siege, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Doge Francesco Foscari's letters to maimed, recently unearthed in Ottoman archives, reveal stunning duplicity. Promises of trade concessions if the Sultan spared Venetian properties during the coming storm. Meanwhile, Venetian captains in the Aegean intercepted Byzantine pleas for grain, selling the shipments to the Ottomans instead. The Republic's emblem, the Lion of St. Mark, didn't just symbolize pride, it was a predator sniffing the wind for profit, no matter who bled. Yet the deepest cut came from within. Emperor Constantine XI's own advisor, the Megas Douloukas Notaras, allegedly uttered the infamous words, "Better the Turkish turban than the papal tiara." While historians debate its authenticity, the sentiment reflected Byzantium's fatal divide. Orthodox hardliners distrusted the Catholic West's promised aid, seeing union with Rome as spiritual surrender. When Genoese captain Giovanni Giustiniani arrived with 700 men to reinforce the walls, whispers spread that he was a papal puppet. On the siege's climactic day, May 29th, Giustiniani fell wounded, and Venetian troops abruptly abandoned their posts, triggering a panic the Ottomans exploited. Whether by malice or misfortune, the West's help had become the empire's undoing. Even religion proved negotiable. Maimed's Grand Vizier, Zaganos Pasha, was a converted Greek who knew Byzantine weaknesses intimately. He orchestrated the nighttime positioning of Ottoman ships over greased logs into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain barrier, a maneuver possibly leaked by Genoese spies. And when the walls finally fell, it was Venetian renegades who guided Ottoman troops to the city's richest monasteries, their knowledge of secret passages more valuable than any cannon. The final irony, days before the fall, 3 Venetian ships slipped past the blockade carrying desperate refugees among them, scholar Cardinal Isidore of Kiev disguised as a beggar. In his satchel were precious Byzantine manuscripts saved for Western libraries. The Venetians would profit from Byzantium's knowledge long after its bones were dust. Constantinople's fall wasn't just defeat, it was a reckoning for an empire that trusted the wrong allies, in a world where gold and survival outweighed oaths written in blood. The Habsburgs didn't conquer Europe, they married it, one strategic union at a time. While other dynasties waged wars to expand their borders, this cunning Austrian family turned wedding vows into weapons, stitching together an empire so vast the sun literally never set on it. It all began with Rudolf I, a minor count who stumbled onto the imperial throne in 1273, not through battle, but by outmaneuvering rival electors with promises of gold and titles. His true masterstroke, though, was arranging his son Albert's marriage to Elizabeth of Gorizia-Tyrol, a match that brought the mineral-rich Alps under Habsburg control without a single sword drawn. From that moment, the family playbook was clear. Why bleed for land when you could inherit it through a well-placed bride? The dynasty's breakout moment came in 1477, when Maximilian I wed Mary of Burgundy. This wasn't just a love story, it was a geopolitical heist. Burgundy's territories stretched from the Netherlands to the Swiss border, and Mary's sudden death in a hunting accident 5 years later should have ended Habsburg claims. Instead, Maximilian Strong armed their toddler son Philip into a betrothal with Juana of Castile, the unstable but fabulously wealthy daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. When Juana's siblings died mysteriously young, leaving her heir to Spain's global empire, the Habsburgs hit the jackpot overnight. Gold from the Americas, armies from the Low Countries, and fleets from Naples now answered to a family that had started as Alpine upstarts. But the real dark genius of their strategy lay in their infamous marriages between cousins. Charles V, who ruled half of Europe by 1519, wasn't just the product of one Habsburg alliance, he was the culmination of dozens. His Aunt Margaret governed the Netherlands as his regent, while his brother Ferdinand married into the Bohemian and Hungarian royal lines. When the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman crushed Hungary at Mohacs in 1526, Ferdinand didn't just inherit the crisis, he inherited the claim to its throne thanks to his wife Anna's bloodline. Even as Turkish armies besieged Vienna, the Habsburgs kept arranging weddings. Ferdinand's daughters married into German duchies, binding Protestant and Catholic factions to the dynasty through sheer familial entanglement. Their most audacious move, the Spanish Habsburgs' silent takeover of Portugal in 1580. When King Sebastian died childless at the Battle of Alcázar, his aged uncle Cardinal Henry took the throne, but Philip II of Spain, nephew of the late Portuguese king, had already married his daughter Isabella to a series of strategically impotent nobles. As Henry's health failed, Philip's agents flooded Lisbon with bribes, while his spies spread rumors that Portuguese independence would invite Ottoman invasion. By the time Henry died, the Habsburgs didn't need to invade, they simply walked in, welcomed by nobles who'd been pensioned off for generations. Yet the system's brilliance was also its poison. Those same intermarriages that built the empire eventually bred the infamous Habsburg jaw and a litany of genetic disorders. Charles II of Spain, the sickly product of generations of uncle-niece unions, couldn't even chew his own food. His death in 1700 triggered the War of Spanish Succession, where decades of shadow diplomacy unraveled in gunpowder and betrayal. The Habsburgs had proven that dynasties could rise faster through vows than violence, but in the end, even the shrewdest matchmakers couldn't outwit biology. Their legacy, a map of Europe drawn in marriage certificates, and a warning that every alliance, no matter how carefully crafted, carries the seeds of its own undoing. So what do centuries of whispered treaties and backstabbing handshakes teach us? That the medieval world didn't run on chivalry or divine right. It ran on cold, calculated pragmatism. Every crown secured by marriage, every war won by mercenaries paid with enemy gold, every throne propped up by borrowed loyalty proves one thing: survival wasn't about who had the sharpest sword, but who kept the best secrets. The Magna Carta, the rise of nation-states, even the borders on our maps today, they were all shaped by deals struck in torchlit cellars, not just battles on open fields. Think about the echoes of these shadow games. The Habsburgs' marriage web-birthed modern diplomacy's delicate dance of treaties and trade-offs. The Hanseatic League's economic strangleholds foreshadowed today's corporate lobbying and sanctions. Even the Borgia's poison and Papacy playbook finds its mirror in modern political scandals where power brokers still operate in the gray spaces between law and ambition. The medieval world's greatest legacy might be its unabashed honesty about human nature. Trust is fragile, loyalty is negotiable, and every alliance has an expiration date. Yet for all we've uncovered, history's vaults are still crammed with unanswered questions. What pacts were burned to hide their betrayals? Which wars were really fought over marriage contracts we'll never find? The Templars' lost treasury, Byzantium's vanished archives, the letters that never reached their recipients, they're all reminders that the past is a puzzle with half its pieces missing. So the next time you see a castle's crumbling walls or a portrait of some long-dead king, look closer. Behind the guilt and glory, there are always whispers of the advisor who sold the keys, the mistress who intercepted the letters, the banker who funded both sides. History isn't just written by the victors, it's ghost-written by the dealers in the dark. And if these forgotten schemers could reshape continents with nothing but parchment and promises, imagine what secrets might still be waiting, tucked between the lines of time.